Well, good evening. Don Vino thought that I should title this Lessons from an Old Fossil. And I chose to make this a little bit more academic. And so we're using the word engaging 2021. I added the phrase and beyond because I hope that what I'm saying extends beyond this year. In bringing this to you, I'm using a number of there are four basic areas I want to talk about. And I really wish I was there in person so that I could engage you. And there's a number of topics I would love to hear from you folks that are doing workshops and plenary sessions. I think one of the great highlights in learning is just to be present at conferences and to learn from others. And that's what the good of a conference like this really is. Well, let me begin by just talking about the word engaging for a minute. What do we really mean by that word? Well, a few years ago, we had a speaker at Cedarville University, and he came in and spoke on the topic engaging the culture. And by the time he was finished with his message, which ran about 25-30 minutes, we were all experiencing high blood pressure and wondering what was going on. Basically, what he did was to talk about embracing or accepting, taking in the culture. And I couldn't miss, and right after the chapel session, I walked up to him and I said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Is it just simply embracing to take everything in from the culture? No discernment?" He said, "Well, I didn't get to that part of my message." Well, I can tell you what happened, because we had alumni that wrote in, we had donors to the college that wrote in, and everything else wanted to know what was going on. So one way of looking at the idea of embracing, engaging, is to think of it as accepting and embracing. And the other side of that would be, of course, to withdraw from the culture. And of course, you have monasteries, Orthodox, Roman Catholic. I would hesitate to put the Amish in with this because they do have some contact with culture. So that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at engaging is to enter into conflict. We talk about engaging in war, for instance, engaging in a battle, in a fight. And so when I think of this, I begin to think of experiences that I've had here. When I left high school, I took a job with a defense contractor for several years, and at night I would take courses in electrical engineering. And then I had an experience with God whereby I gave my life to Him, and I decided to go to Bible college. And I entered Bible college in the second semester, which was in January. And when I got there, I looked around the campus a bit, and I saw a lovely young girl whom I later married. And I had the toughest time trying to date her. And the reason for that was she was the babysitter for Walter Martin. And every weekend she would go up to his house and babysit. Competition was pretty tough in that case. And so I got to know Walter, and later to work with him. I traveled to all of his engagements, on the Long John Neville show, on different debates he has, in different speaking engagements in church. I was on the Bible Answer Man. Sometimes I would take his place. And the real Bible Answer Man uses only the Bible. Walter Martin would tell you that. You don't come with your computers and everything else. You use just the biblical text. But Walter's favorite verse was in Jude 3. And that was the verse that said, "Contend earnestly for the faith once for all handed down to the saints." Now, when you look at that word contend, the Greek meaning of it is to struggle for. And what Jude is saying here is to struggle earnestly for the faith. That is to win, to struggle to win for the faith. Greek scholar Bill Mounts has a statement about this, and he says it's time to take off the kids' gloves and to duke it out. And so we get into entering the conflict in this. But the way that Walter would describe it is he would say, don't just give him a swift kick in the seat of the pants. Walter would say, go for the jugular vein. Now, I'm going to tell you, Walter had a tender heart for all people. But when it came to an enemy of the Christian faith, he could really be brutal with them. And so we have an idea, and we have it in apologetics, whereby the idea is to enter into conflict, to enter into debate, into argument, into discussion, and to win. And while I understand that, I would have to say that I learned about debating very differently, and I want you to hear the way that I learned it. When I was in high school, I was on a debate team for 4 years. It was interesting. When I first joined the team, the first couple of classes I sat in, our instructor, our coach, said to us, now I want you to look at this topic. And then he said, and when you come on Thursday, we're going to have a debate. There were 10 people in the class. He limited it to that. And so we were given a topic, and we went out and we studied it, and we were ready to give it. And then what he would do is when we got there, he'd say, now you're pro and you're con. And so the first guy, whose name started with A, he got to be pro. He was defending the topic. I got the other side of it, which is con. And to tell you the truth, I only studied the pro side. That is the side for it. And I said to him, don't I get a choice? And he said, no. He said, I told you to study the topic. And when you study the topic, you study all sides of the topic. You know, it's not like this congressman or senator that says on television, we just study one side, we know what the truth is. You don't know what the truth is until you study the other side, because they may have the truth. And so you need to study the whole subject. And we learn to do that and to be very careful and to be exhausting in what we would look at and study when it came to debate. And it was a great lesson to begin with, and I continue to do that even to this day. But then there was something else that came up in the debate which interested me. And there was one time we had one-on-one debates. And in this debate, I cleaned the other guy's clock. Did a really good job, and I was pretty proud of myself. And you always got to watch pride when it comes. And he came to me and he said, well, how do you think you did? I said, I think I really did great. He said, I think yes and no. I said, okay. He said, yes, you cleaned his clock. No, you didn't win the person. He says debating is not merely about winning an argument or the discussion. It's also about winning the person. And too frequently in apologetics, we get caught up with the idea of let's just win the battle, win the argument. But we don't necessarily win the person. And that becomes so very important in this. Not only are we to win debates and discussion, but we also have to work on winning the person toward what we're presenting to them. And so in doing that, I always like a verse in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 24 and 25. It says this, the Lord's bondservant must not be quarrelsome. The Greek word there is to do verbal battle. That's not our task alone. But to be kind to all, able to teach, patient when wronged, correcting those who are in opposition, if perhaps God may grant them repentance, leading to the knowledge of the truth. No, we don't argue people into the kingdom of God. We present the gospel as clearly as we can. We become the tool that God uses to present it, but it is God who brings people to himself. So one way of looking at the word engage is to mean just to embrace. Another word is to enter into conflict. But a third way, and the way that I want to present it tonight, is simply the idea of drawing a favorable attention or interest in what I'm presenting. I want to get people to begin to listen to me, to become interested, hopefully to accept what I'm saying. But through the years, I found that there are some difficulties, struggles that we go through with this. And that's what I wanted to present to you tonight, perhaps some things you've really never thought about. And in doing this, I'm trying to present a topic to begin with that would help all of us, not just the apologist, not just the person who wants to talk about education or some other topic, but that might help all of us. And so I have 4 basic themes. The first one I want to present to you is this fact, that everyone brings baggage to the encounter. I know you're going to tell me I am objective. No, you're not. No, you're not. I tell students, the only difference between you and me is I know I'm not objective. You don't. You don't. Now, I want to illustrate this for you so that you can get an idea of what I'm talking about here in this. And to do this, I'm going to use a passage in Acts chapter 14. This is the first time that we can tell of, that we have on record, in Luke's accounts at least, in which the gospel is presented by Paul solely to pagan people. Solely to pagan people. This is Paul now not in the places, the synagogues, not talking with Jewish people, but to people who are pagans. So if you turn to Acts chapter 14, I just want to read for you Acts chapter 14, verses 8 to 15, and then verse 18. Here's the way it goes. At Lystra, there was a man sitting who had no strength in his feet, lame from his mother's womb, who had never walked. The repetition of this indicates something of the incurable nature of that. This man was listening to Paul, who, when he had fixed his gaze on him and had seen that he had faith to be made well, said with a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." The man leaped up and began to walk. Now, when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they raised their voice, saying in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have become like men and have come down to us." And they began calling Barnabas Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifice with the crowds. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their robes, a sign of blasphemy, of horror, and rushed out into the crowd, crying out and saying, "Men, why are you doing these things? We're also men of the same nature as you, and we preach the gospel to you, in order that you should turn from these vain things to a living God, who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them." Then verse 18, even saying these things, they with difficulty restrained the crowds from offering sacrifice to them. Presuppositions, control beliefs, difficult to overcome, and they help in interpretation. In this case, you might say, what happened? Well, these people came at it, and while Paul preached the gospel, they heard something else. They took Barnabas to be Zeus, and Hermes was Paul. Now, why? Well, number one, you saw in the reading of this text that the priest of Zeus comes and wants to offer sacrifices to the crowds. You also know there's a temple just outside the city gates. And so the Greek religion was very prominent in Lystra. And these people approached what Paul was saying with the Greek religion and reinterpreted it in that context. Perhaps another way of looking at this would be to consider that Ovid in 8 AD published a book called Metamorphoses. And it's an account of Zeus and Hermes in this very region, disguised as mortals, meeting a pious aged couple, Baucis and Philemon. And they reveal their divine nature to this couple. Now, I think, and I agree here with Ben Witherington down at Asbury, that maybe the people of Lystra may have known this story. And so when Paul and Barnabas came, this explains their response, thinking that, oh, this is Zeus and Hermes in disguise. But whatever the case, what happened here is Paul encountered a reinterpretation of the message that he gave. People bring baggage to the encounter. They brought their Greek religion. I think Paul learns of this because his second encounter, which occurs on Mars Hill, when Paul is confronted with the unknown God, Paul simply says, let me tell you who he is. And here's what he says. Now he starts out with God, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by hand, nor is he served by human hands as though he needs anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. Well, what a great change that occurs here. And of course, we learn as we encounter people as well, too. But the idea of bringing baggage to the discussion, to the encounter. I thought a good illustration of this might be tonight some background work I did years ago with Edmund Gruss on the Jehovah's Witnesses. And just to give you an idea here, I'm going to look at Charles Taze Russell, founder of the Watchtower, founder of the Jehovah's Witnesses. He was over in the Pittsburgh area, and Russell and his family went to an evangelical church, Calvinistic. And from what we learn from people is that Russell was taught the doctrines of the Christian faith very early on. In fact, Charles Taze Russell says on one occasion that he was one who believed the doctrines of the Christian faith, which he now disagrees with. And in fact, we even have accounts of Charles Taze Russell writing with chalk on fences and also on sidewalks. And what he was doing was basically to write Bible verses encouraging people to come to the truth and warn them about the punishment of hell. So he believed these things. Well, what happened? Well, a couple of years later, when he was 15 or 16 years of age, he was challenged by a childhood friend. And in this, he expressed doubts about eternal punishment. In fact, he was trounced. And he finally, ultimately, gave up on the Bible. But 2 years later, he happened to hear a second Adventist. Now, this is not a Seventh-day Adventist. Second Adventist is one who believes in the coming of Christ. His name was Jonas Wendell. And from Jonas Wendell, and listening to him, he discovered that man does not have a soul, and the wicked are annihilated. Well, that sounded pretty good to him because that would help him to deny eternal torment. And he says that it renewed his faith in the Bible. Now, Charles Taze Russell worked for his father in a clothing store, and they started to study the Bible in the basement, he and a bunch of friends. Now, as much as we know about it is that they would discuss a topic, and then they would come to a conclusion, and that would be their theology. I'm going to say here that I would guess that his basis in this that he used was reason. And if I'm correct, and I think I am, and the reason I can say that is when you talk to Jehovah's Witness, they'll tell you, well, God is not triune. Why not? Well, how can you have three in one? How can you have three persons in one God? Can God be omnipresent? No, he can't, because no human can be two places at one time. How about creation? If there was nothing but God, then God must have created it ex nihilo. So rationality or reason becomes the basis. I think their theology was formulated like this, that he started out with the statement, there is no eternal torment. If there's no eternal torment, there's no place for torment. Hell is the grave. If there's no eternal torment, there's no conscious existence after death to be tormented. That means the soul is mortal, the wicked are annihilated. If there's no conscious existence after death, then when Jesus died, he ceased to exist. But God can't cease to exist. Therefore, Jesus is not God. The Trinity is false. If I go a little further with that, Jesus is not God, then salvation is not God's work. It becomes man's work. And I can turn that around, and that basically becomes where the Jehovah's Witnesses are today. So when you have these strong presuppositions, this baggage you bring to everything, and you have to understand it this way, it's got to fit, what you believe. It's a tough thing to overcome. If I can give you just one more illustration through the years, let me just take Seventh-day Adventist for a minute for you. And I think you can see this one even more clearly. In 1818, William Miller, Baptist minister, mid-state Pennsylvania, predicted that Christ would return 25 years, 1843. So from March 21st, 1843 to March 21st, 1844 was the time period he set. Well, March 21st came and went. Nothing happened. His disciples, some of them, changed the date to October 22nd, 1844. Now, when October 22nd came and nothing happened, this was called a great disappointment. And as these people that followed Miller and set this date were walking around the town, they were ridiculed by the townspeople. It was a man named Hiram Metzen. In order to escape the ridicule of the people, he decided to walk through a cornfield to get somewhere. In the midst of the cornfield, he has a vision. And the vision simply is this. The interpretation, the date was correct, but the interpretation was wrong. Christ is not going to return to this earth. He's going to move into the heavenly sanctuary and begin his work, the investigative judgment. And so now we have some new teaching. The sanctuary doctrine, investigative judgment. And then in the 3 years, 1844 to 1847, two other people join him. Joseph Bates joins him, bringing the Sabbath, seventh day. Oh, here comes a cat. And Ellen Harmon joins him, brings the spirit of prophecy. Now that becomes the key blocks to Seventh-day Adventism, the foundation. I'm going to tell you, that stands firm no matter what anybody else says. That's the baggage they bring. For example, if I can go one step further with this, we had a couple of occasions in which there were people in the Seventh-day Adventist church that rose up and pointed out difficulties. Remember Walter Ray? He wrote the book, The White Lie. And basically what he was doing, I got to push my cat away here. Basically what he was doing was talking about plagiarism. Ellen White, though all these words were given to her by God, plagiarized from a lot of accounts in that time period. And she was caught. And he wrote a book about it. He got defrocked for it, lost his ministerial credentials. And in fact, to this day, what they tell me is, well, God allowed her to do that. Nonsense. It was plagiarism, pure and simple. Another one, sanctuary doctrine and investigative judgment, the very heart of Seventh-day Adventism. Desmond Ford over in Australia, on the faculty at the seminary in Avondale, a fellow of Robert Brinsmead, I think his name is. And he decided to challenge their understanding of Daniel 14. Whoa. Well, he wrote a 991-page dissertation on it. And it's called Daniel 8:14, the Day of Atonement and the Investigative Judgment. They called him to a meeting out in Glacier View Park in Ward, Colorado in 1980, I believe. And basically, well, they didn't even read the manuscript. They just simply said that what he was teaching was contrary to Seventh-day Adventist doctrine. And they took away his ministerial credentials and he lost his teaching position. You know, baggage can be a tough thing. And what I'm telling you is we all have. Well, we're not, I say I try to be as objective as possible, and I do. I mean, I hope you do too. And so we listen to other people. But when you come with the baggage, it does deter what you can accept. Makes it hard. And so just to give you some illustrations of how that works in our day and age. Now, my second theme, a little different, is simply this. Words are like empty cans until you fill them. Words are like empty cans until you fill them. It's like an empty can. Until you put something in it, you don't know what it is. You don't know whether it's chicken noodle soup or whatever. So, to give you an idea of this, in communication, when we communicate, what we do is we give our meaning of words to the words that somebody is saying so that we can understand them. So we can understand them. Now, when we do that, see, when somebody mentions the word God, we automatically think of our God. But they may not be meaning the same. We talk about Jesus, they may not be meaning the same as we do. And so when we do this, we have to understand that it's our words that we're giving to it. And that's what determines how we understand their meaning. Now, can we have some crazy situations? Let me give you one. Good illustration of this. I was on the school boards in New Jersey for a number of years. And this is a true story that happened to friends of mine, the Waltons. And there was this occasion when Ricky, their son, came home from school, third grade. And when he came in the house, he said to his mother, "Mom, what's conception?" Now you can imagine what you can fill that word with. Well, his mother heard that, and her face was in horror, and she was mad. She called me on the phone because I'm on the board. And she says, "They're teaching sex education in the third grade. What are you going to do about it?" I said, "I don't think so." I called the superintendent. I asked him to call the teacher. She had no idea what he was talking about. She affirmed she was not doing that. And so later, I called Rich, his father, and I said, "Rich, just ask Ricky, what did the teacher say today?" And little Ricky said, "Dad," she said, "I had no conception of what she was talking about." You see how you can give meanings to words, come out with the wrong thing. And so I want you to understand that. When I talk, I wonder what people put into my words, and sometimes I get the words wrong that people use. So I wish I had this up on overhead for you so you could read this. But I'm going to give you an illustration to begin with of what happens when we as Christians give our meanings to words used by a cultist. And the most dangerous area here in this is with the cults of Christianity. Ron Rhodes, myself, and others, because they use Christian terms. Now, here's what I want to show you in this, and I want you to listen carefully to this. This is an article I did some years ago for Moody Monthly, and November 1979. I told you I'm an old fossil. And this was with Cheryl Short, and it was a catalog of the cults. And we got letters in from the editor, to the editor. And the letters to the editor were really, pretty good. But there was one there in which the editor of Moody Monthly took me to task. Now, I want to show you what happened to this. And again, all I can do is just read this to you. But this is from a bishop in Ogden, Utah. And he says, "Not that it matters to a magazine, noted for its refreshing honesty and objectivity when it comes to anything outside the so-called born-again or evangelical movement. But I would like to draw your attention to the fact that Mormons teach that Christ was indeed a pre-existing being with God the Father. The editor said to me, "Jim, isn't that what we believe?" I said to him, "Jerry, the question is not what I believe by those words, but what the Mormons believe by those words. You do not understand what they mean by that. You put your meaning into this and said, yeah, he pre-existed. Christ pre-existed with God the Father because he was God the Son. They believe that God once lived on a planet, and he and his wives now live, and they procreate spirit children. Jesus is the one, the first sexually procreated spirit child. There are many others. You and I were spirit children up there. We pre-exist. Is that the same as what you mean? Jesus is sexually procreated by a heavenly Father and a heavenly Mother? No. Same words. Second statement. Christ spoke of the glory he had with the Father before the world was. That Christ was the Jehovah of the Old Testament and was involved in the creative processes of the earth, as witnessed by John 1:1-3, Colossians 1:16, and Hebrews 1:1-3. Jehovah of the Old Testament. Well, that was his name as a spirit child in heaven. And so very easily. But here we're talking about a spirit child with the name Jehovah, not the second person of the Trinity. Same words. Third one. Jesus was born the Son of God the Father through Mary. Mary, his mother, was carried away in the Spirit. 1 Nephi 11:13-21. Was overshadowed by the Holy Ghost. And the conception, which took place by the power of the Holy Ghost, resulted in bringing forth of the literal and personal Son of God the Father. Jerry said, well, we believe that. I said, no, you don't. No, you don't. I said, Jerry, literal is the way we understand language today. How'd you come into existence? You have a father and you have a mother. They had sex. You're the product of it. What they mean here is that God the Father, who has a body of flesh and bones, came here to earth and had sex with a mortal woman named Mary, a virgin. And the result of it was the birth of Jesus. Literal and personal Son of God. He is the literal Son of God the Father because God is his Father, literally, here on earth. It's the same language, Jerry. Same words, but we have different meanings. So one has to be very, very careful of language. And listen, it's worth asking. If you're not sure, you even have a thought about it, say, well, what do you mean by that? If you were to describe God to me, well, who is he? I think then, you won't run into the problem of making them Christian. You may find out that they hold something very different, and you need to share the gospel to them. And the letter ends with, again, not that it matters. You and yours will go on cranking out the same falsehoods, the same half-truths, the same loaded words such as cults, to label others regardless of what one says or writes. I called him up on the phone, talked to him. We had a long talk about this. He understood after a while that I had different understandings. And so to begin with here, I would say, secondly, that we have to watch the words that we give our meanings to. But there's another way of looking at this too. And that is what happens when someone listens to us and gives their words to us. What happens when someone in a cult listens to us? Oh, I says, I know what that means, and it reinterprets it to mean what they mean, like what happened in Acts 14. Now, I have an illustration of this just to give you an idea. Many years ago, when I was teaching at Northeastern Bible College, I had the opportunity to do a Bible study up in American Salem at headquarters, right across the street, actually, from Christian Research Institute, Surrey Drive in Wayne. And so when I was doing this, I had a number of people there, about 30 people that came. They gave us a place we could meet, where we could have lunch 1 hour. It was great. But the second year, the college changed my schedule, so I couldn't do this. And the last time that I was there, one of the ladies came up to me and she said to me, she said, you know, she said, when you study the Bible and you teach the Bible, it really says something. It means something to you. She said, I listened to it and I can't get much at all. And I thought for a moment and I said to her, well, I said, tell me a little bit about your spiritual journey. How did you come to Christ? She said, well, she said, my parents were Christian Scientists. And she said, so I grew up in that faith. But then we had an argument with Christian Science practitioner. And so we left, and I said, where'd you end up then? Unity School of Christianity. I said, okay. I said, and what then? She said, well, she said, I heard Walter Martin speak, and he told how bad unity was, and she said, I got out of that. I said, what'd you do next? She said, I went over to Echo Lake Baptist Church. I've been there for 10 years. I said, okay. I said, tell me, who is God? She said to me, well, God is a spiritual force manifested in everything in nature. I said, is God personal? She said, no. She said, God is spirit. God is infinite mind. I said, you know what your problem is? You don't understand the Bible because you don't know God. You don't know who God is. You've been sitting in that church for 10 years reinterpreting what the pastor preaches. An evangelical church, a fine church. You've been just simply reinterpreting it because you don't know who God is to begin with. And it's kind of scary. You know, I know when I teach and I speak, I know there are people will gathering. Probably some of you are doing that right now. Hopefully you're not reinterpreting my words. But nonetheless, this is something that we need to consider when we're talking with people. I think one of the worst compliments I ever heard was to someone that Don Vino knows well, Harold Camping, one of his favorite teachers. And Harold Camping was giving a presentation at a banquet, and I was standing behind two ladies that went up to him. And at the end, he thought he really did good and whatever. And these two ladies said to me, oh, she said, if Mrs. Eddy was just alive today, she would have loved what you said. He took it as a great compliment. I said to him afterward, I said, that wasn't a compliment, really. She's the founder of Christian Science. So we need to watch words. The third one that I have for you is not ready for solid food. Give them milk. This one is getting more and more of interest to me. And I notice certain passages in the Bible that say this. For instance, Paul, 1 Corinthians 3, says, I fed you with milk, not solid food, for you were not ready for it. Indeed, even now you are not yet able. The author of Hebrews, chapter 5, you have come to need milk and not solid food. Well, I've had lots of experiences with this. And so I'm going to try to explain as best as I can a number of parts of this, the number of parts to this. So, number one, as we start out in this, tell you about an experience that I had in Russia years ago, 1995 to be precise. I don't know how I got into this situation, but I did. It's in Obninsk in Russia, really the center of...
In Russian, in ordinances.
How did that come on? Okay, in ordinances. Okay. Obninsk is about 68 miles southwest of Moscow, population 90 to 100,000 people. It is the scientific center of Russia. It has the first nuclear power plant in the world, was built there. Second one was in the UK. I was at the International Academy of Modern Knowledge, and Alexander Postnikov was the president there. And my job was to come over there and to teach. And the course was apologetics, to teach the pastors. Well, that's right up my alley. And so I went there to teach. And it was interesting when I got into the things that was going on there. I got roughly 6 hours sleep before having to teach all day on Monday. And I was tired, admittedly. And so when Monday came, I got up. We taught from 8 to 12, had lunch at 1 o'clock, and then we taught from 2 to 3, 2 to 4. So those were the hours that I had, and it was a long day. Well, I started out right away, and I thought I was teaching in graduate school. Now, you know, when you teach in college like I do, and if you move up to graduate school, you up the ante. You raise the stakes, you know. Well, I did. And so I got up to teach. And I started out, and I got about 2 lines. Now, I only knew 2 words in Russian. Da, yes, and yet, no. I got through 2 lines, and my interpreter turned around and said, "Niet." I looked at her, and she said, "I don't know what you're saying, and they don't know what you're saying." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "These are pastors. They were forbidden by the Russian government to go beyond the 6th grade. They have no more than a 6th grade education. What are you doing?" You know. Well, I said to her, "Give me a half hour." She said, "A half hour is not going to correct this." I said, "A half hour can correct it." The reason I could correct it is because I've been teaching my daughters apologetics, and they were 11 and 12 years of age. And I had to get it down to there. And in a half hour, I was ready to go again. I invested a lot of time with those people. Lunch, I have to tell you, I hate beets, but they had borscht every lunchtime, even at night. That is beet soup. And I even remember on Saturday when we went out, I spoke in a Russian church in the morning. And when we were coming back, there was a vegetable place, a market. And I saw corn, so I bought some corn for ladies. I was eating with them all the time and working with them. And one of the pastors that was with me said, "Oh, they got a big bag of beets over there. We're running out of beets." I hated to buy those beets, I'll tell you that. But anyway, I would stay there from 4 and eat lunch and eat dinner with them as well. And then I would stay there till 9 o'clock at night. My interpreter stood with me as well. And she was paid apparently by the Russian government. I was paid by the Russian government to do this. And I mean, it worked out great at the end of the period. But I, under the impression that I was teaching graduate students, was way, 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 way off in terms of communicating with this. You know what frightens me the most was when my wife would say to me, "I'd like you to come and speak to my kindergarten class." That scares me more than anything. I got to get down to their level. Got to bring the food, you know, down to them. I learned this in my church. There are people who come into our church. I have to tell you about our church. We have 29 ordained pastors, about 650 people. And we have almost 100 people with earned doctorates. Some with as many as 3 earned doctorates. It's a tough church. And I think our level is up here. And we have people from the community that come whose level are down here. And it's hard for them to understand. I mean, I have people walk out of church and they don't understand a word the pastor was saying today. I have some of them from the town in my adult Bible fellowship class on Sunday. They can hear me and understand me, but they don't go to the church service. We have developed at Grace Baptist Church an ABF called Gateway, in which we try to start them at a lower level. The problem is making that transition where they move from there to where we are in the congregation. So you have to be careful in our communication that we're communicating at the same level that the people are. It's very, very, very important in this. And so I try as much as possible to get it down, to those areas there where they are. Now, I have a friend over in Ghana, Pastor Moses, and he ministers in the impoverished villages up in northern Ghana. They're poor people. Most of them are illiterate. They cannot read or write. Some are Muslim. Most of them are animists, idol worshippers. Now, Pastor Moses takes a group of people and goes up into villages that have not been reached. And he goes up with cloth, so that women can make dresses and things. And he goes up with bags of food, yes. And then he goes up and he preaches. You'd say, how does he preach to them? They don't understand words or whatever. They can't read, they can't write. How do you do it? He tells stories. Great storyteller, uses pictures. I had slides to show you him drawing this picture, and also a very animated fellow. And then he has 3 presentations, 3 steps to salvation, and 12 dynamic principles for a disciple of Jesus. When they get through, there are a number of people that give profession of faith. He then sends up one of his workers who goes up and teaches the others. They all do it with pictures, the same things. They all teach the same. Great storyteller. I remember years ago hearing Ravi Zacharias tell me, he said, my mother, she had a story for everything. I believe that. Whatever the interest, whatever the subject was, she had a story for it. And I have to tell you one other one here, just recently, a letter from a missionary over in the Middle East. He has a tough time reaching people with the gospel. But he said at home he would sit. He lives in a 2-story home, and above him is his Muslim landlord. And what he would do is he'd sit out on the porch in the summers and all the time. And he would just sit there and he would read the stories of the Bible. And he said it was interesting that one day his landlord came down and told him that he and his children had been listening to the stories and wanted to know if they could join them down there. And in a short period of time, the wife would bring food down and they'd have dinner together. And he said, for the first time, he said, I began to make inroads with some Muslims. And then what was it? Stories from the Old Testament, from the New Testament that he would give. So, when we look at this and we're saying, we want to communicate. Got to communicate. Got to bring the food down to where the people are. We got to learn to do that. I'm sure.
Paul, Diane Mitchell.
Sorry. Hang on a minute. I got to get rid of that. Okay, there it is. Sorry about that. Okay, but stories would be a good way to communicate. They got to get it down to where the people are. If you're talking to children, you bring it down to their levels. You want to talk to adults in general, bring it down to a high school level. I mean, if I'm speaking to a group of scholars, that's a whole different ballgame. And let me tell you, I was using big words in Russia. I mean, really big words. I shouldn't, I regret what I did, but I learned my lesson back then as to the problem with this. Well, my last one here that I have is something like this: 1 + 1 does not equal 2. And this is the idea of syncretism. I'm running into a lot of this when I'm out witnessing with people. Sometimes I don't know where people are coming from. And this one, the first one I want to tell you here is a little bit to deal with culture. Now, I was in Norway. I go to Norway every summer, except for the past year because of COVID. And at this time, I was in what was called the Vikinghuset, which is the Viking Museum. And I had looked at the ships and everything, and there was a video that was coming up, a movie, and I wanted to see that, of some of the findings they had of the ships. So I sat down on the bench, and while I was sitting there, a lady came up with a baby. And she came up and sat on the same bench. And she said to me, she said, "Where are you from?" I said, "The United States." She said, "I'm from Beijing." I said, "I was just there 3-4 months ago in February." She said, "Really?" She said, "Why?" She said, "Well, I was over there with a group of people, scholars." I said, "We visited churches, Christian ministries that were there. We met with the American Embassy." And she said, "What do you do?" I said, I teach Bible and theology." So she said, "Oh," she said, "I'm a Christian." I said, "You are?" And she said, "Yes." She said, "I attend a house church." This is a non-registered church. And she told me approximately where it was. And I said, "That's a big house church." It's one of the house churches that we did visit. And I said, it's in a big building. It's a huge business complex. And I said, "You have basically the 3rd floor and offices on the 5th floor. Is that the one?" She said, "Yeah." "Well, I met your pastor and pastors." I said, "What I like about your church is next to the church office, there is a Starbucks. I've been trying for a long time to get that in my church, but you have it." She said, "Well, if you're a Bible teacher, maybe you could explain to me." She said, "A question that I have." And I'm thinking to myself, okay. And she said, "Where did evil come from?" I said, "Well, you got a cell phone?" I said, "Why don't you take it, look up Genesis chapter 3. So I took her through the passage and showed her where Adam and Eve both disobeyed God's rule, and that was the cause of the start of evil in the world. She looked at me and she said, strangely, she said, "Where is the woman with the basket?" I'm thinking to myself, what? And I said, "You're not referring to Pandora's box jar, are you?" She said, "Oh, yeah. No. If you know the story, what she has done here is she has taken something that she has learned in the communist school. You know, believe me, the Chinese communist understands basically they have the kids up to a certain period. Can't teach Sunday school to them and whatever. And so they're indoctrinated with these myths and stuff. And so she learned this myth. And it sort of fits this because Pandora was the first mortal woman made by the gods. And the story goes that one of the gods stole the fire that was up there with Zeus. And Zeus responded by sending a jar full of evil and disease down to earth. And so when Pandora marries Epimenedes, she opens the jar and all of the evils and everything in the world come out. Where's the woman with the basket with all the evil? So somehow or other, in her Bible knowledge, as she's learning and she's growing and she goes to a Bible study, she still incorporates some of the things that she has learned in the school systems and has been indoctrinated with some of the things of the Bible. Well, finally, her husband, her parents came, other relatives. It was about 10 or 11 of them. And we all sat, and I went through this whole thing about mythology, and that what you're doing is bringing something in here that doesn't belong here. If you read the text, all that it says there is that Adam and Eve disobeyed God, and that was the beginning of all evil and disease in the world. And it was a great opportunity. But I find more and more some strange things that people piece together. On the other hand, it can be a cultural thing. I remember being up in Limerick, Maine, some years ago, and I think it was a Friday, Saturday, Sunday weekend because I taught during the week. And there was a man that was there, was a member of the Blackfoot tribe. Right now, that's the Blackfeet Nation. And the pastor said to me, I want you to talk to that guy. And he said, I want to talk to that Injun. And I said, first of all, get rid of the word Injun. Stop. I said, second, tell me what the problem is. He said, well, he doesn't come out to everything in our church, and he's got this medicine pouch that he's using. I said, okay. I said, it's how are you going to do this? So after the service on Friday night, I just asked him if I could talk to him for a few moments. I told him the pastor had asked me. I said, I want to talk to you about that medicine pouch you have. He said, yeah. I said, no. I said, tell me about your spiritual journey. Well, he had really made a commitment to Christ. No question about his belief. And I said, what do you use that for? Well, he said, sometimes when I get sick, I just take this out. He said, I don't have it all the time, but I take it out, and it helps me. And I said to him, it's interesting. You commit your life to Christ, and you trust him for everything in the future. If you can trust him with your life, can you not trust him with your health? And he looked at me for a while and he said, I'll keep my pouch. I said, well, just think on that. Just think on that. This is magical stuff that he's using. It's not any type of medicine. It's not aspirin or anything like that. And so on Sunday night when I was leaving and I just finished everything, and he came up to me and he handed me his pouch. Said, I don't need it anymore. But Christians can bring things in. I mean, certainly we have a bunch of astrology people in Christianity, and other things as well too. And if there's one that's growing in Christianity right now, it's the Enneagram. We even got a Christian Enneagram. So, it's amazing what creeps into our culture. So there you have the basic ideas of what I would be talking about. I mean, if I were there in person, I would love to talk with you about, number one, just the idea that nobody's purely objective. We all bring baggage. And with the sinfulness, the ability to think wrong as well, too. We all bring baggage to the encounter. Secondly, words are like tin cans. Depends on what you fill them with. Some people listen to us and they fill it with their meanings and they think we're saying the same thing they are. We listen to people, give our words to people's words, and we think they believe the same that we do. We need to be asking questions as, what do you mean by that? Third thing is milk. More and more I become convinced that if we really want to communicate well, we need to get it down to the level of the people that we're feeding. And in some cases, it may be the best thing to do is to get it down to the story level even, to present the gospel. Fourthly, syncretism. Lots of things mixed together with the Christian faith. And all I can say is, take the time to work with them on this and help them to think it through. I'm trying to think of how to conclude this. And I thought probably the best thing would do for me to give you the advice of an old Vermont farmer. My wife was from Vermont, And when I visited up there, a lot of times I go fishing with her uncle. We fish in the streams for the most part. Brook trout, rainbow trout sometimes salmon. But we were out fishing in a farmer's farm, and there was a creek that went through the water, and there was a pretty good fishing place. But all of a sudden, while I was out there, I saw a horse come with a blanket on, and I saw the farmer running after him. And I made, that usual comment that we make. I said, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. And the farmer stopped and he walked over to me. He says, yes, you can, Sonny. I said, you can? He says, yes. He said, salt is oats. I thought for a moment, salt is oats. He gets hungry, he eats his oats. He gets thirsty, he drinks. That's pretty neat. The bottom line of all that I'm saying here today is our basic job really is to salt the oats, to create the thirst, to be the best tool that God can use, to be very careful in what we communicate and how we communicate. And so people can hear the truth. But God's the one that leads them. But we're the one who present the truth. And so I just would remind you of these areas that I've talked about tonight. And I honestly wish that I could be there to talk to you personally and even to hear your talks tonight. But Doctor hasn't allowed me to do that. So I wish you the best here. And as you listen carefully to what people are saying. I've got some really important topics. I think following this, what's going on in education. And then you even got the critical race theory and some others. Not to mention the presentation on the Enneagram and things. There's lots of things here that are really hot in our culture at this time that we're going to be able to, that we have to present to them the truth as the best we can for God's glory. So thanks a lot for having me today. I wish you the best. And Don, it's all yours.